Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of the Women in Contemporary Theory Speaker Series. I'm Teresa Valentini, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Italian Studies, and I'm one of the co-organizers of these speaker series alongside Rand, who's here, and she's a PhD candidate at the Center for Comparative Literature. I want to start by thanking both our departments, the Department of Italian Studies, Center for Comparative Literature, to support these events. And I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors. So the Women and Gender Study Institute, Institute Visual Studies, Mississauga, the Center for Jewish Studies, for European and Eurasian Studies, Cinema Studies Institute, and the Graduate Chair for Italian Studies. Their involvement shows us that these speaker series speak to a wide and also interdisciplinary community, and so we hope that all these talks will spark interdisciplinary discussion, conversations. And for us, the speaker series is a chance to give visibility to not just to Italian women philosophers who are still under-recognized in North America, but also to scholars, professors, and students who are doing their research on these women's theories. And for this reason, we hope that this speaker series allows us to create a sense of community among scholars, students, professors, but hopefully also the broader public who are interested in these topics. And we hope that this is going to be a space for new collaboration. And quick word on this year's theme, Forms of Power and Impotentiality. We all know that power has always been an issue in how we interact and with each other, how we define our own identities. And today, this is even more pressing since nationalistic movements are on the rise, and there's a sort of increasing concentration of power in the hands of a few. So, in this series, we want to reflect on where we see these oppressive forms of power today and explore alternatives of resisting and responding to these forces. Now, without further delay, I'd like to hand it over to our amazing speakers here today. And I also want to thank all of the speakers that accept to collaborate on this event, because without them, we could have had this speaker series. But I also want to thank Antonio, Silvia, and Diane on a more personal note, because it's thanks to their works and also the Society for Italian Philosophy, which some of them are co-directors, that I was introduced and got very passionate about this fascinating world of women and contemporary Italian theory. So with no further ado, honor to present our first speaker here tonight, Professor Diane. Her talk today is titled Against Vulnerability on Power and Feminist Resistance. Diane Enns is professor of philosophy at Metropolitan University in Toronto, specializing in social and political thought, and she's the director of the Society for Women of Ideas. She's the author of Thinking Through Loneliness, Love in the Dark, Philosophy by Another Name, The Violence of Victimhood, Speaking of Freedom, Philosophy, Politics, and the Struggle Liberation, among other titles. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you very much to Teresa for planning for inviting me. Thank you. So I'll just read my paper without any preamble. The theme of human vulnerability has preoccupied feminists for several decades, and Italian thinkers, Elena Pulcini and Adriana Cavarero especially, have contributed much to the scholarly debates. Both of these philosophers stress that vulnerability plays a primary role in motivating care for others and for a world marred by injustice and violence, and thus provides an extraordinary for political engagement. Their work is situated within a rich feminist tradition, counters the modern subject self-sufficient, masterful, and masculine, with a relational subject cognizant of human interdependence and the need for a public practice of care based on shared vulnerability. This is an attempt to vindicate vulnerability for feminism, release it from an association with weakness and victimhood, and affirm its potential. In another scene, we are witnessing the rise of militant feminist struggle against public and private manifestations of sexualized violence, especially in Latin America, but also in Italy and elsewhere. What is known as the strike, transnational in scope and unprecedented in scale, has since 2016 inspired accounts of what Veronica Gago calls an alternative theory of power, or feminist potentia. Gago, it is the counterpower of contemporary feminist mobilizations that provide an escape for women and feminize others from fear and victimhood to strategic capacity and power. There is no affirmation of vulnerability in Gago's description of feminist power. We find instead is an argument for militant insubordination, a war of self-defense against sexualized violence. In what follows, I will explore the implications of the intriguing juxtaposition of feminist perspectives on vulnerability and power. When we consider gender-based violence, its global scale, it's even when something close to equality has been achieved, formal equality, cruel physical and psychological effects, an emphasis on vulnerability seems incongruous. My title is deliberately provocative. I will not be arguing that we need to overcome human dependency and vulnerability and join the ranks of Promethean man, dreaming of his invincibility. I take for granted the relational subject central to Cavadero's and Pulcini's analyses, and I'm sympathetic to their accounts of vulnerability, especially to the latent invitation to acknowledge our vulnerability in these dark times. But I am curious as to why a paradigm of vulnerability appeals to feminists, and will suggest it betrays a reticence in power in the context of women's struggles, which reinforces a view of her as always already male and vulnerability as always already female. This reticence to discuss power, I suggest, poses a formidable stumbling block in women's struggles against violence. So my section of 3, the vulnerability romance. The affirmation of vulnerability as a fundamental feature of tradition is developed in both Cavadero and Pulcini as a critical response to the historic figure of sovereign man, master of his own destiny and fate of the world. Cavadero's frame of rectitude, a term that encapsulates the features of universal man, standing erect, a paragon of virility and righteousness. From Plato's Homo erectus, leaving the cave to stand upright in the sun, to rational man finding the moral law within and ruling over himself, the entire history of philosophy is traversed by the figure of the righteous erect man, writes Cavadero. Pulcini's example of Prometheus, the mythical modern man driven by an acquisitive instinct that transforms into a never fully satisfied search for the power to guarantee the preservation of his life. Ever accelerating and technology have perverted the Prometheus of modernity, Pulcini adds, updating his hubris into a full-blown rebellion against human limits and rejection of all living things. This is the creature Anders calls Homo Creator, who dreams of omnipotence governed by the principle, what can be made must be made. Homo erectus and Homo Creator are thus both figures that disavow human vulnerability. While Pulcini does not elaborate a feminine figure in contradiction to Promethean man, Cavadero offers an alternate posture to upright man that is eminently female. She writes, for herself, but always for the other, the lover or the children that attract. They make her lean out of herself, and they impose on her as natural, typical and stereotypical, an inclined posture. Cavaretto famously interprets Leonardo da Vinci's 16th century painting The Virgin Child with St. Anne as an emblematic depiction of inclination. This painting depicts Mary bending over the infant Jesus while her own mother and according to Cavaretto, a mother leaning over her child or her lover is the archetypal image of care for the other. Though she readily admits the stereotype of the self-sacrificing mother is notorious to dismantle, she concludes that the maternal inclination exhibited in Leonardo's painting can be our point of departure in the task of rethinking vulnerability as ontological and relationality as constitutive. A posture a posture inclination thus saves us from the dangers of upright man's disavowal of the vulnerability he fears will undermine his rectitude, and thereby challenge his right to carry out violent practices of domination, exclusion, and devastation. Pulcini makes a similar case for the necessity of accepting the intrinsic relationality and thus vulnerability of all living beings, especially in the face of present planetary and political crises. In fact, she insists, taking up vulnerability actively and consciously as a motivating force is the only chance we have to take care of it. The fear and anxiety we are experiencing as we feel the shock or helplessness feel the shock of our helplessness are necessary to rouse us from apathy and acknowledge our interdependence. This acknowledgement will stimulate solidarity and the practice of care. Similar to Cavaretto, then, Pulcini believes the subject who realizes her vulnerability undermines the self-centeredness and sovereignty of the whole, saving us from its excesses. We can trace these ideas back to Levinas, who famously claims we are hostages to the vulnerability of the other, able to respond to their absolute and unavoidable appeal because we are also. But for Pulcini, the more important reference is Butler's account of precariousness as an ontological state, a vulnerability and interdependency fundamental to the human condition, as well as socially or politically produced vulnerability. In order to care for those most exposed to precarity, increasingly a generalized global condition, Pulcini argues we must accept our vulnerability, thereby overcome the unlimited individualism with its lust for invulnerability that we have inherited from modern Prometheanism. I'm sympathetic to these arguments. We can certainly trace environmental and destruction to the mad quest for invulnerability, which is at once, to Simone Weil, the race for power. The sheer global scale of the problem and the extreme powerlessness of the human species vis-a-vis the natural, utterly indifferent to our needs and desires, reasonably leads us to consider the political possibilities of acting on the basis of shared vulnerability. Grasping the indisputable fact that human beings are mere planeta would be a good lesson for sovereign man. If the impetus of being aware of our inherent vulnerability is to care for a dying world, we might agree it is in this instance a strength rather than a weakness. As Valentina Muro suggests, Pulcini, as well as Cavaretto and the tradition of care ethics more generally, transform vulnerability from a negative state that must be overcome into a site of agency from which to foster collective practices in the care. So part 2, the elephant in the room. However, when we shift from a focus on human vulnerability in the face of natural to women's or feminized individuals' vulnerability in the face of men's aggression, the terms of the discussion must change. There is no intent behind nature's random attacks, no punishment to be meted out against hurricanes that take lives and destroy homes, no justice to be had. We are simply at the mercy of nature. But women should not be at the mercy of men. In our account of vulnerability and our response, it isn't enough to note the distinction between the vulnerability of the human condition and the vulnerability that is forced on us, precariousness versus precarity in Butler's terms. We must respond differently to conditions. Humility and deference are necessary in order to respect nature's power over us, but must be vigorously rejected by women whose lives are governed, circumscribed, and sometimes cut short by masculinity. While this point seems obvious to me, for the woman in the face of her abuser wants to be anything but vulnerable, the feminist discussion of vulnerability appears to avoid the elephant in the room, power, as something to claim. Perhaps in the valuation of the vulnerable subject as an alternative to the sovereign subject, feminists have overcorrected, and in the process romanticized the condition of vulnerability and interdependence. The avoidance or rejection of power tends to reinforce a definition of power as masculine domination. As evidence, consider the symbolic use Cavallero makes of erection. She fails to observe that the majority of the time the penis is folded quietly in on itself, a model of inclination, though it admittedly inclined towards itself rather than others. She ignores both the possibility that horror can emerge from a non-position, as Simona Forti notes, and that standing upright is a posture women need to claim. The romanticization of vulnerability has overlooked further ambiguities. For example, to note that vulnerability is both the cause and effect of violence. This explains my uneasiness with Cavallero's choice of the infant and mother as ideal figures in the critique of rectitude. While she acknowledges the risk of falling stereotypes, she justifies it on the basis that some stereotypes critical potentiality that is useful. In this case, the iconology of the Virgin Mary can highlight an alternative ethical posture of verticality. But she fails to substantively consider the immeasurable damage of the iconology, the immense weight with which it has burdened women. And not only women. Consider certainly the infant's vulnerability forces the ego to renounce its autonomy and independence, as Cavallero points out. Pulcini writes similarly of the powerful pull the infant exerts on us. She affirms Hannes's claim that the unmistakable plea of the newborn is difficult to resist. But the infant's abject helplessness also elicits abuse. Vulnerability is a double-edged sword. It can inspire, but also the worst forms of cruelty. This applies as much to the infant as to the victim of intimate partner violence. Furthermore, the infant's dependency can be experienced as a violent appropriation of the mother's own autonomy and freedom. Who must care for a dependent day after day, young or old, able or disabled, loses herself and may come to resent it. Dependent, too, may be consumed by resentment, enraged by the fragility that necessitates their dependency. Both scenarios may erupt in violence. We may think differently of Leonardo's painting if it depicted mothers inclined over a severely disabled or ill child, themselves without care or support, beatific smiles erased by suffering. We would do well here to turn to Leah Melandri for her analysis of love and violence. She argues persuasively that men's violence toward women they love is a response to their unbearable encounter with vulnerability and dependency, prompting denial through violence. If we emphasize women's vulnerability, we further enable men to project their own vulnerability onto the women they love, ultimately imprisoning women in a perpetual state of potential victimhood. It is precisely woman's inclination over her lover that makes her susceptible to masculine rage. Butler recognizes this risk in their more recent work, The Force of Nonviolence, albeit in the context of vulnerable generally. One of Butler's primary concerns is how to avoid producing a class of victims whose agency and power are denied when organizations care for vulnerable populations. Butler asks, once the vulnerable are constituted as such, are they understood still maintain and exercise their own power? Or has all the power vanished from the situation of the vulnerable, resurfing as the power of paternal care, now obligated to intervene? This seems encouraging shift towards recognizing the limits of a feminist revaluation of vulnerability. Butler goes on to say that while acts of resistance do not follow domination, we shouldn't reduce vulnerability to passivity. On the contrary, vulnerability and resistance can work together. When migrants, for example, make demands for entry, Butler notes, they are not precisely consciously overcoming their vulnerability, they are demonstrating it and demonstrate with it. What happens is not the miraculous or heroic transformation of vulnerability into strength, but the articulation of a demand only a supported life can persist as a life. Reluctance to call the migrants' collective demand an experience of power originates in the assumption that we must never associate vulnerability with powerlessness. But it seems reasonable to say that migrants are actualizing a moment of power against those responsible for their exploitation and subjugation, overcoming their vulnerability through solidarity. Why not call this a heroic transformation of vulnerability into strength? Why not acknowledge that migrants are, in fact, weak in relation to a dominating force that seeks to subdue or eliminate them, and that their only hope is to acquire power by banding together in refusal? I am suggesting it isn't vulnerability that is a site of agency or a form of resistance, as Valentina Moro concludes, but rather the power of solidarity. According to Butler, however, the notion that we can or should overcome vulnerability is a very masculine idea. Men's violent aggression against feminized living beings and against the planet itself originates in a masculine disavowal of vulnerability. Women must not follow suit. In this claim, Butler forgets their own distinction between precariousness and precarity. What women must overcome is vulnerability forced on them. To make this argument does not change the fact that we are relational beings who share ontological vulnerability. In the present moment, as we face the collapse of social infrastructure and the breakdown of civility due to volatile emotions and political polarization, the paradigm of vulnerability suitable for a liberal era is inadequate. That vast numbers of men are intensifying their refusal of vulnerability, violently projecting it onto women, means it is imperative that women grasp needed to act in self-defense. I do not need and cannot depend on a proponent of genocide, a convicted rapist, or my verbally abusive misogynist neighbor, and I wish I had not once been vulnerable to an abusive intimate partner. When everyone gets along, our shared vulnerability elicits all the right responses: compassion and care, acts of kindness, and possibly the solidarity that rouses us into. Violence utterly transforms the terrain. Fear is not motivating in a moment of violation, but crippling, as any woman walking alone at night knows, or even in broad daylight, depending on the circumstances. A victim or potential victim does not appreciate her vulnerability in that moment, and she lives in hope of grasping enough power to overcome it, to flee to safety, or to escape her tormentor. Part 3, Feminist Potentia. This brings me to a very different kind of discussion, prompted by international feminist mobilization against femicide and gender-based violence more broadly. There is certainly a widespread feeling unprecedented is happening in the global feminist demonstrations and strikes since December 2012, when thousands of women gathered in Delhi streets to protest the cruel gang rape and killing of Jyoti Singh. In Argentina, Iran, Spain, Poland, and in cities throughout the world, women have been demonstrating and striking in rebellion not only against rape and femicide, but against the criminalization of abortion, economic precarity, racism, social inequalities, and the treatment of migrants. In Italy, the catalyst galvanized women and gave birth to the movement Non Una di Meno, or Not One Woman Less, was the murder of Sara Di Pietrantonio. On that name, every time I say it, Pietrantonio, a 22-year-old student strangled and burned to death by her ex-boyfriend in 2016. On the following International Women's Day, more than 60 cities in Italy participated in a global women's strike that displayed, according to Paola Rudan, unprecedented feminist organization and mobilization. Women occupied public squares to refuse sexual harassment at home and at work, cuts to social services, the burden of reproductive labor, among other injustices. Rudan writes, they inappropriately turned what is conventionally a form of collective bargain to a political weapon. Her analysis of the strike stresses the terms of refusal and agency in the face of a historically constant form of violence that is now visible in an unprecedented way. Its proponents anxious women's demands for freedom across the globe and reassert male social power. Out of this refusal, Rudin notes, an unexpected subject emerges. Not woman as perpetually vulnerable in need of benevolent institutions, but woman as a driving global political force organizing for a radically changed society. We find this political force elaborated in the work of Veronica Gago, who locates in the more militant forms of Latin American feminist resistance, particularly the strike, an alternative theory of power. She calls it feminist potentia, and describes it variably as counterpower, constituent power, capacity, the force that drives what is perceived as possible, or the desire to change everything. Though Gago approvingly refers to Butler's affirmation of a vulnerability that women must not overcome for fear of men, it is a reference that sits incongruously in Gago's text, particularly when she suggests we use the terms of war to offset the pathologies of male sexual violence. Yet war, she writes, is to stop covering up the violence, to stop passing ourselves in the face of everyday violence, and traverse the fear. This is a war of self-defense against the femicidal offensive, neutralizes women politically by confining them to victimhood. Thus, in both, Thus, in both Rudin's and Gago's analyses of the feminist strike, there is a focus on power that's beyond contestation to something more confrontational, an act of refusal that appears to instantiate something new, which they articulate as a rejection of women's historical relegation to victimhood. In Rudin's words, the Una de Meno strike was an attempt to refuse victimhood and the identity politics in which feminism is often mired, and to wield a political weapon against a gendered and global form of power, with the aim of acquiring the power necessary to unsettle the neoliberal order materially. Gago similarly comments on the strike's capacity to disturb the mediation between women and victimhood, suggesting that fear must be translated into strategic capacity rather than victimization. This means situating women and feminized individuals as political subjects in a struggle, the systematic attempt to reduce them to victims in need of protection, be repaired generally by the state. Gago poses a question we may all be asking. What does it mean to feminist forms of self-defense when confronted with increased violence? The question of a possible violent response to masculine aggression rarely comes up among feminists. And when it does, it suffers the same fate as the suggestion women might need power. Veronica Zabadua-Yanez attributes this neglect to a more or less explicit normative injunction to pacify feminism and more feminine vulnerability. An injunction that she argues risks reducing the heteropatriarchal gendering of violence. But the worry is that a feminist practice of violence would mimic patriarchal violence and simply incur further brutality, initiating a vicious cycle of violence. This is not a call to arms. I am suggesting we need to reflect on this retreat from discussions of resistance as an act of self-defense, one that might be militant and violent. While we have engaged seriously with Frantz Fanon's assertion that decolonization necessitates a violent response, depatriarchalization, admittedly an awkward term, is not part of our vocabulary, let alone the idea that it would demand violent resistance. But the vicious cycle of violence is already in play, as Fanon for us so viscerally in the context of colonialism. Women are also among the wretched of the earth. Perhaps, whether or not militant or violent action is called for, asking the question initiates a symbolic shift, the one Fanon makes when he refuses the amputation of racism. For women, the symbolic shift may occur when she loses her fear and realizes her abuser no longer holds power over her. This, I ask, if not standing upright. I've only touched on an immensely complex and vexing subject to reflect on the ambiguous relations between vulnerability, power, and feminist resistance, and on what I consider a deep ambivalence towards power and violence on the part of women, or feminists more particularly. This is evident in what I have argued is an association of vulnerability with the feminine and power with an attachment to vulnerability as therefore politically promising, and a rejection of power as always already dominating or violent. While we need to do much more work on understanding power when it is grasped by women, it will no doubt have the same risks as power in the hands of men. No matter who wields it, power can always be abused. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Are we to collect all the questions after the three? Is that what would you prefer?
Now? It's up to you.
We were thinking question at the end. Would that be okay? Sure. Okay. The next speaker is Professor Antonio Calcagno. His talk today is titled "When Hegel Spits Back: Carla Lonzi, Oppressive Power, Impotency." Antonio Calcagno is Professor of Philosophy at King's University College at Western University in London. He currently serves as Executive Co-Director of the Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy, author of On Political Impasse, Power, Resistance, and New Forms of Selfhood, Lived Experience from the Inside Out, Social and Political Philosophy in Edith Stein. Along with Silvia Benso, he's the translator of Elena Pulcini's work, Between Justice, the Passions, and Social Resource, which appears in the SUNY Press Contemporary Italian Philosophy series. Let's give him another round of applause.
So I'd like to, for the kind invitation, and to thank today's and Dan for organizing such a wonderful series here at the university. And I also want to thank Adriana Monti, who's here, who's lived through and who was fundamental in the Italian feminism of the 70s and 80s. So thank you, Adriana, for coming. Yeah. Undoubtedly, Lonzi's work occupies a central place in the history of feminist practice and thinking. Her ideas about power, patriarchy, the unconscious, consciousness raising, art, and art criticism have left an indelible mark on philosophy. Fair to say that the scholarly work that we have on Lonzi to date reads her out not only as a critique of patriarchal power and its oppressive violence on women, but also as a call for women's own self-defined empowerment. The logic of such analyses tends to situate Lonzi's understanding of political power as a vis-a-vis relation, that is, a binary of male versus female power and empowerment. As long as we see women equal or not with men, patriarchal violence and oppression will continue. Lonzi explores the writings of Hegel on power, especially the master-slave dialectic and the feminine to fortify her case. Moments in the phenomenology of spirit are examined to show how patriarchy continues to unfold and absolutize itself. It would be a serious error to deny the validity of insights about these moments in Hegel's philosophy and in social political life. They are clear and distinct moments of patriarchy. Yet, I argue here that perhaps we can find in Hegel a deeper, healing insight. As spirit marches forward in its quest for rational, real understanding and freedom, as it marches toward the absolute, trying to capture the narrative of the phenomenology of spirit, perhaps we uncover beings a more universal and destructive form of power, which Diane and that we're all capable of doing to engaging in, namely what Augustine describes as the libido dominandi, habendi, and noscendi, the drive to innate, possess, and kill, to which all human life and formation is subject. Patriarchy then becomes a particular form of a universal human power to destroy and oppress. Different identity, in and of identity, be they along the lines of race, gender, ability, class, etc., do not preclude being affected or conditioned by this more universal sense of violent power. Hegel, in a sense, Lonzi to look not only at the particular moments of social and political structures, but the whole of human development and existence. And it is here that we find this larger sense of oppressive power that pays heed to differences of identity like male and female. Hegel may spit back. Lonzi's essay, Let's Spit on Hegel. Hegel spit back at Lonzi and forces all to face the destructive power within, oppressive capacity for human violent power, which, following Marx, when universalized, becomes impersonal. Furthermore, we face a real limit of our humanity, our impotency to avoid our own collective human tragic being, especially as it moves from the personal to the interpersonal and ultimately to the impersonal. I'd like to just briefly discuss Lonzi on the structure of patriarchy. So, in her famous essay, Let's Spit on Hegel, Carla Lonzi claims that the oppression and violent subjugation of women is rooted in patriarchy, in part justified and created by Hegel, understood as one of the great paradigms of Western modern enlightenment, as it seeks to determine women maximally, including women's own self-perception, identification. The achievement of male patriarchy operates in and throughout various levels of life and human existence, from the material necessities of biological life to embodiment, sexuality, economic structures, social and political configurations, to psyche and affectivity. The key to such subjection lies in the creation, reproduction, and maintenance of a binary view of sexuality marked by two poles of sexuality and gender, male and female. The way the binary structures itself and its corresponding reality creates the very conditions that make male hegemony possible. Women's liberation and power to self-define and shape themselves as individual, Lonzi argues, relies on the rupture of this patriarchal binary. Lonzi writes, quote, "Women must not be defined to man. This awareness is the foundation of both our struggle and liberty. Man is not the model to hold up for the process of woman's self-discovery. Woman is the other in relation to man. Man is the other in relation to woman. Equality is an ideological attempt." So she's really slamming the liberal tradition of equality. Equality is an ideological attempt to reject women even further. Yeah. For her, the emphasis is on self-determination, right? That kind of move of self-definition. And so she writes, "The identification of woman with man means annulling the ultimate means of liberation." Quote. Lonzi finds in Hegel's philosophy three key paradigmatic strategies repeatedly deployed to simultaneously, some would say in a schizoid fashion, speak of and construct a universality, or a supposed universality, whose very instantiation and incarnation always bespeaks female exclusion, othering, and negation. First, there's a postulation of a universal humanity. This is the great liberal claim, the great humanist claim of a universal humanity, which in reality is the result of white male Western liberal imperial class. Second, there is the logic of recognition and the supposed idea of struggles between equals in the name of greater freedom. And finally, there is the historical development of an ethical society that collectively strives for greater being and becoming in and through the life of state, religion, and philosophy itself. Universalism, equality, and community are identified by Lonzi as the modern Enlightenment concepts and practices used in contemporary life to exclude and oppress women while falsely claiming women as part of this modern Enlightenment project of freedom and rationality. So how does Lonzi, the philosopher, justify her claims? It is clear from Hegel's own writing, as Lonzi astutely observes, we have consistent doublespeak. Yeah? On one hand, the universal and absolute are achievable in and through the self, as it moves through its various stages of development. Yet, we also learn that the universal is sexed, with spirit manifesting less in women. It is clear that Hegel repeats the old patriarchal structure of philosophy and medicine, in which women is lesser in being than man. No real justification of this claim is given on Hegel's part other than the traditional conviction claim of male supremacy. The second paradigmatic of male patriarchy that we find in Hegel has to do with the claim of modernity as the historical epoch. Modernity, 1500 to 1900, that's the period he's, well, that's how Hegelians read modernity. Um, uh, the second paradigmatic sorry, the second paradigm of male patriarchy that we find in Hegel has to do with the claim of modernity as the historical epoch of the full recognition of human equality. This is what enlightenment really is supposed to achieve. Here we find the universality that is supposed to include and encompass men and women, all beings, which later manifests itself as hierarchical, exclusive, and oppressive, especially in relation to women. Lonzi turns to the famous analysis of the master-slave dialectic to study more closely the relation between recognition, equality, power, and patriarchy. Master-slave dialectic, we know that the self comes to recognize itself as similar and different from others who appear to the consciousness of the self. And though there is a mutual recognition of the similitude of self and other, male and female perhaps, they each try to determine and control one another. One can easily insert, of course, male and female here, though some Hegelians would resist such a quick substitution. Both self and other struggle to the death, Hegel says, for dominance, but they both realize at a certain point in their desire to kill one another and destroy one another, dominate one another, that this is a pointless exercise. That end up destroying one another. And so as the self and the other come to realize their finitude, morality of their being vis-a-vis the other, both decide to formalize their similitude as selves, as equality, as both poles of the relation selves and eyes, and they are formally recognized and constituted as equal. We know later that this formal recognition of equality will come to be determined in various forms, be they political, religious, or it seems then that male and female, though similar and distinct, can come to recognize each other as equal in dependency as well as capacity, so Hegel says. A modern Enlightenment form of equality articulates itself in and through the negotiation of difference through struggle. We see this idea of recognition play out in Western liberal democracies, especially in their legal systems. Indeed, as Paolo Melchiori notes, equality comes by grosso modo many feminist struggles rooted in Anglo-American liberal context. Lonzi notes, especially in through Hegel's discussion of community, which we'll discuss shortly, that the supposed equality of recognition and power between male and female is short. For as the phenomenology advances, it is clear that once again, women's power and equality can only be sanctioned by men, for example, in the discussion of women as largely confined to the family within the structure of the state. Never truly enters into the full life of the state. Lonzi devotes a considerable part of her essay on Hegel's discussion of women within the configuration of community, the third modern patriarchal paradigm. It is here, in his discussion of sociality, in its materiality and history, clearly repeats and instantiates the old patriarchal structure, albeit in modern language and form. So far, Hegel has posited the universal humanity as equal, but the unique differences of human beings as they begin to build social life must be allowed to come to the fore, especially if they are to be understood as part of the march of freedom that is constituted for the very being of the self, the absolute in its awareness of itself and in its power. Hence, male and female take on supposedly equal though differentiated roles in the larger society that ultimately subsume the individual while bestowing a greater sense of being to them. The state, for example, can be seen as achieving such an Aufhebung of the individual self into a larger collective structure of human life. Part of the establishment of social roles and function, Hegel, as Lonzi reads him, is the confinement of nurturing of family and blood ties. She remains stuck, Hegel says, in this relation, in an eternal irony of community. When men push further for social press, hating, despising, and distancing themselves from family blood in order to create larger, more encompassing structures which can shape ultimately history, for example, the state. It is that we once again find a double standard here. Woman who is equal and necessary for social growth and progress, but only insofar as that she can safeguard a basic unity of sociality, family, and blood. But in progress calls for larger, more complex structures, powerful structures, which are to be created and administered ultimately by men. Patriarchy, as Lonzi notes, continues and repeats, even with modern enlightened emancipation discourses. These are the liberal discourses that she's very critical of. Hegel's logic is clear. The dialectic itself, especially in and through its moment of negation, operates such that women, whether as individual or in community, is seen as harboring some insufficiency, lack, abstractness, or limit, which ultimately can be overcome in and through the male, who and which unfolds ultimately larger, more uncomplex structures that build on human rationality and freedom. The male in the end comes to absolute fullness in religion, ethics, politics, art, and philosophy, whereas woman is always on the way, but complete, says Lonzi, similar but not similar enough to me. Often it is women's nature, understood in the classical sense, that is viewed as deficient, other, or lacking. And to show there is modern progress, Hegel at least frees women from the status of ancient classical chap or property, while inserting her in the dialectic of enlightenment progress, but only in a functional and limited way. Woman is determined by the fuller, complete, and progressive male. Lonzi spit on this view of Hegel. She hates it, yeah. And rightfully so. Okay, so what does she give? A constructive project. She's giving you this marvelous critique, and so she rejects Hegel. And so, in order to rupture the patriarchal dialectic of history, freedom, and rationality, the Enlightenment, Lonzi argues that women are from the male determining pole of the binary. In breaking the dialectic, women turn to define themselves not in terms of recognized equals, but as self-determining autonomous individuals, free to become and explore their own individual being, sexuality, and gender, outside of this binary. Lonzi saw in psychoanalysis and in feminist consciousness-raising groups a possible means for achieving the aforementioned break. Paola Melchiori observes, quote, the underlying hypothesis of consciousness-raising practices was that the group eliminated the presence of men, which is what impeded women from thinking of themselves for themselves. In the primary scene of patriarchy, Melchiori goes on to say, women are obliged to represent the continuity of existence, while men enact the dreams of an immortal and non-embodied mind. Out of the existence and by the male presence, paradoxically, the pervasiveness of its imaginary prey becomes even more evident, but can be kept at a distance, can be analyzed and filtered. The primary scene of patriarchy can be elaborated only by the combination of material absence and imaginary presence. So this is the play of the unconscious that you find in Lonzi and in consciousness-raising groups with their engagement with psychoanalysis. Melchiori goes on to say, a group of women then permits the permanence of the aforementioned view through women's collective presence and by making available to women different imagination about themselves, thereby legitimating different links between body and mind and making possible a different knowledge production. End of the citation. Consciousness raising allowed women to see the primary scene of patriarchy and how it structured women's lives, psyche, sentiments, and being. And through collective group work, we could help each other turn towards themselves in order to take possession of their own self-determining capacities. Despite the difference that arose between women, as Melchiori notes, progress was made. Lonzi speaks of possible resonances. She has this whole theory of resonances between women, which help individual women find solidarity and support of their own collective quest for emancipation and self-determination or autonomy. She highlights the importance of female pleasure, in particular sexual pleasure, as a key embodied site of female desire. And Lonzi takes up Freud's division between vaginal and clitoral pleasure, though skeptical and uneasy at such a division, ultimately calling for the rejection of the vaginal image of female pleasure that is only achievable through male penetration, and the embrace of clitoral pleasure that is in need of no male intervention to be achieved. Luz Irigaray reminds us of the self-defining, self-giving, and autonomous pleasure of the female sexual organs themselves. And Lonzi's discussion of female sexuality is not simply material and physical, for she accepts the intimate relation between human psychological development and sexuality as foundational for any project of human self-determination and definition. This we don't find in Hegel. Yeah? And this is really key in her own approach. Female sexuality is motivated by drives, impulses, fantasies, and desires, all important sites for the experience's own self-defining capacities and ends. Okay. Hegel has been spit on, and he's maybe could look back at Lonzi, and he might say, maybe the analysis is really limited. But Lonzi's rejection of Hegel and his modern patriarchal progressist views of history makes way for her own constructive feminist response. And I maintain here that Lonzi's analysis of structuring power of modern Enlightenment male patriarchy is correct. I really do believe that. She really gives a really wonderful critique of liberal equality. But patriarchy is a historical phenomenon, and it does manifest in different ways through diverse cultures. And though Lonzi captures aspects of modern patriarchy, Hegel may still look back at Lonzi and present a different challenge. Yeah. If we turn to Hegel's notion of the absolute, I don't believe in the absolute. Neither should you. But the fantasy of the absolute, the desire for the absolute, that's important in Hegel. So if we turn to Hegel's notion of the absolute, we find the claim of a universal vision of humanity, both male and female. We see that conflict and struggle, so vital for Hegel's system, are endemic to all human beings, be they female. Could it be then, as we become more conscious of our humanity, and we become more aware of the power structures as they develop and how power changes through time, yeah, and aspects as they move, which we all share at some level of humanity, patriarchy itself ruptures the neat binary of male versus female, causing the poles of the relation to be sometimes blurry and porous when set within the framework of universal humanity capable of conflict, violence, and oppression. So what can this mean? It also means that patriarchy can also be co-opted, deployed by any gendered person or group for a plethora of personal, social, and political ends and aims that exceed the confines of the male-female patriarch binary. This is not to say that you can dismiss the patriarchy. You can't. That's just the typical patriarchal thing. Well, you just get rid of the binary, and then you just have. We all do it. So what's so unique? The patriarchy remains as a specific structure. You cannot get rid of that. But what Hegel says, or what I think Hegel can show us, is that it's an and. You have that patriarchy, so be aware that it can move and take on different forms that are connected to a larger sense of power, human power to destroy. Those who identify as men can use men, women, and all varieties of gendered expression at bay in order to reach other ends or goals. Likewise, all varieties of gendered individuals can deploy patriarchal logics and forces for their own ends, which may not include sexual ones. Feminist philosophy has certainly shown us how patriarchal laws work across gender and sex spectrums. And Hegel has to concede that Lonzi's argument captures a moment in feminist history. But as history moves, we see that Lonzi's understanding of patriarchy not only applies the way she delineates, but also and simultaneously across gendered lines. So I think of the philosopher Janine Jones, who gave a paper and said, some of the violence that we see in the world today um, is is not simply patriarchal. It also lines, and she had this very moving discussion at the readings of the Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy, not without controversy, of course. Augustine of Hippo, three forms of libidinal desire: possession, killing, and domination in all human beings. And perhaps at this point in history, the structure of patriarchy is deployed and plays out not only with the binary of male and female, as he argued nearly 50 years ago, but in a more pervasive and universal sense, well, which the neat differences between male and female, with the neat differences between male and female being more fluid and subject to change. Hegel may look at Lonzi's argument and he may ask, what happens when patriarchy moves beyond the neat male theory into the broad range, universal range of gender and sex identity? Hegel, like Augustine and maybe Innocent III, reminds us of the universality of the misery of our human condition, which often desires and seeks to oppress. I'd like to conclude here by moving to another stage. So the power is not only confined to the patriarchy. There's also an impersonal aspect of power. This is what Marx rightly understood. I would like here to conclude this paper by presenting another challenge to Lonzi, linked to the Hegelian and Marxian discussion connected to universality, namely the force of impersonal structures of power. That is, when I say impersonal, power that has no particular agent, no particular cause, no particular source that you can delineate or see. It is a complex process where it's very hard to understand the point where the exact author is, or the agent. How does the impersonal come to confront Lonzi's argument? Patriarchy meets new technologies of control, to borrow from Foucault and Deleuze, as patriarchy is taken up in impersonal structures of capitalism, following Marx's ideas contained in the fragment on machines. Could it be that male-female binary perhaps breaks down, or does it become more porous, as it does in the university of tragic human violence of one person to another? So it's that impersonal that I think we have to think about when we want to amplify Lonzi's analysis. It should be remarked here that Lonzi does not consider the implications of her thinking within universalizing logic, whereas the thinker Lea Melandri does. And rather than conceive a universal form of humanity that consists of both male and female, as Hegel does, Melandri universalizes and totalizes patriarchy itself, the male form of power, which comes to structure women's self-relation to themselves, but also their intersubjective relations, women in relation to their brothers, sons, fathers, etc. Melandri, in the end, posits a universal form of humanity that is thoroughly penalized, which must be overcome and rejected. Her response to Hegel is to claim that the universal you posit, Hegel, even in its corrupt inclusive form of male and female, is false. What is universalized as human is the patriarchal form. And while it is true that one can find in Lonzi's essays insights that would push to Melandri's argument, Lonzi in the end retains the male-female binary, rejecting the Hegelian feigned universality. So I want to just turn to the theme of impotency, and then I'll end. If we accept the claim that patriarchy must also be understood within more universal and impersonal terms, can we act to resist and combat it? Here we turn to the theme of this lecture, the impotency. I understand impotency in two fundamental ways. First, the sheer impotence, that is, as an incapacity or an inability to act. And second, I see it paradoxically as a capacity not to act, to make inactive or inert. And the first sense makes all action cease, whereas the latter is a form of action, either by decision, causality, or will, that cease to make another action. We see this sense nicely developed in the work of Mario Tronti and Paolo Virno. They develop a sense of a form of action that makes other actions impotent. We see this in his famous strategy of the refusal of work. I believe that Lonzi's work can be read in this double sense of impotency and advanced above. In a deep way, Lonzi calls for the end of patriarchy in and through the destruction of the male-female that is crucial for the maintenance and reproduction of patriarchy itself, but furthermore, in her creative and constructive projects of resonance, female pleasure, She seeks to render impotent possible future actions that aim at reinventing and extending patriarchy, as Hegel's tragic human universal and Marx's impersonal would suggest. In this sense, we can read Lonzi's project as impotentializing. Lonzi can anticipate the and paradoxical extension of patriarchy in Hegel and Marxist thinking, and she continues to render it impotent by establishing and executing feminist practices that restructure all human relations, male, female, family, friendship, institutions, and politics, not in the logic of equality, but in the logic of self-determination. Yeah. In the end, Lonzi need not even continue to spit at Hegel. For having done so, she now turns to thinking and practice, a real break, and to redefine human relations not in terms of the tragic humanity or the impersonal, but in terms of self-solidarity, resonance, self-becoming, and auto-determination.
I'm so sad that I have to be the one to not conclude, but like move others. After this discussion, I guess we also need some food to remain very objective as well. Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you again to our speakers.